The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked briskly through the corridors, her heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. She had always found comfort in the early hours, when the palace was quiet and she could think clearly about the day ahead. Today, however, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. She paused outside the breakfast room, hearing voices from within. Her daughter Charlotte's sweet, high-pitched laughter mixed with deeper adult tones. Catherine smiled, expecting to find her 9-year-old daughter chatting animatedly with her governess or perhaps one of the staff members who always seemed charmed by Charlotte's precocious nature. As she approached the door, Catherine heard another voice that made her steps slow. It was Camilla, the queen consort, speaking in clipped, authoritative tones that carried an edge Catherine had rarely heard directed at the children. "No, Charlotte, that is entirely inappropriate. Young ladies of your standing do not behave in such a manner." Catherine frowned, wondering what Charlotte could have possibly done to warrant such stern correction. Her daughter was spirited, certainly, but she was also well-mannered and thoughtful for her age. "But, Grandmama Camilla, I was only trying to help with the flowers." Charlotte's voice came through the door, smaller now, confused. "Help? You call that disaster helping? The entire arrangement is ruined. Completely ruined. Do you have any idea how much those orchids cost?" Catherine's hand froze on the door handle. She had arranged for Charlotte to help with the flower arrangements as a small lesson in palace protocol and hospitality. It was meant to be a fun, educational activity, not grounds for such harsh criticism. "I'm sorry," Charlotte whispered, and Catherine could hear the tears threatening in her daughter's voice. "I didn't mean to make a mess." "Sorry doesn't fix anything, does it? This is exactly the sort of careless behavior I'd been discussing with your grandfather. Children today have no sense of responsibility, no understanding of consequence." Catherine felt her chest tighten. Through the crack in the door, she could see Charlotte standing before Camilla, her small shoulders hunched, her usually bright demeanor completely deflated. The queen consort loomed over her, hands on her hips, her expression stern and unyielding. "Perhaps if your mother spent more time teaching you proper behavior instead of gallivanting around with her causes, you might understand how to conduct yourself appropriately." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. Her causes, her work with early childhood development, mental health awareness, and supporting families in need, were deeply important to her. More than that, they were her way of using her position to make a real difference in people's lives. To have them dismissed so casually, especially in front of Charlotte, felt like a deliberate insult. Charlotte looked up at Camilla with wide, confused eyes. "Mummy helps lots of people," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Does she now? And what about helping her own family understand their responsibilities? What about teaching you how to behave like the future member of the royal family you are?" Catherine watched as Charlotte's lip began to tremble. Her daughter was trying so hard to be brave, to meet Camilla's expectations, but she was only 9 years old. She shouldn't have to defend her mother or endure such criticism over what amounted to a childhood accident. "Stand up straight when I'm speaking to you," Camilla commanded sharply. "Slouching is unbecoming. And stop that sniffling immediately. Tears are a sign of weakness, and weakness has no place in this family." That was enough. Catherine pushed open the door and stepped into the room, her composure carefully controlled despite the fire building in her chest. "Good morning," she said evenly, her voice carrying the practiced calm she had perfected over years of public appearances. "Charlotte, darling, I was looking for you." Charlotte's face immediately brightened, relief flooding her features as she saw her mother. She started to move toward Catherine but, then, glanced nervously at Camilla, uncertain. "Come here, sweetheart," Catherine said gently, opening her arms. Charlotte didn't hesitate this time, rushing into her mother's embrace. Camilla straightened, her expression shifting to the polite mask she wore in company. "Catherine, how lovely. I was just having a chat with Charlotte about proper behavior." "So I heard," Catherine replied, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. She looked down at Charlotte, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Why don't you go find Louis and George? I believe they're having their writing lesson soon." Charlotte nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to be dismissed from the uncomfortable situation. She hurried toward the door but, then, stopped and turned back. "The flowers really are beautiful, Grandmama Camilla," she said politely, trying one last time to make amends. "I think the ones I knocked over can still be saved." Camilla's smile was tight. "Run along, Charlotte." When the door closed behind her daughter, Catherine turned to face Camilla fully. The room suddenly felt much smaller, the air thick with unspoken tension. "She's just a child," Catherine said quietly. "She's a future member of the royal family," Camilla replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The sooner she understands that, the better prepared she'll be." Prepared for what? To be afraid of making mistakes? To believe that perfection is the only acceptable standard? Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly. "I hardly think teaching proper behavior and respect for valuable items is unreasonable." "There's a difference between teaching and berating," Catherine said, her voice still controlled but with steel underneath. Charlotte was trying to help. She was excited about the flowers, about learning something new. That enthusiasm shouldn't be crushed because of an accident. "Enthusiasm without discipline leads to chaos," Camilla replied curtly. "Perhaps if certain people in this family understood that, we wouldn't have these issues." The indirect reference to Catherine's parenting style was clear, and it stung precisely because it touched on her deepest fears as a mother. She was constantly walking a tightrope, trying to give her children as normal a childhood as possible while preparing them for their future roles. It was a balance she fought for every day, and to have it questioned so dismissively felt like a betrayal. "My children are well-behaved, respectful, and kind," Catherine said, her voice growing firmer. "They're also allowed to be children, to make mistakes, to learn through experience rather than fear." "Fear?" Camilla's laugh was sharp. "My dear, you mistake discipline for fear. In my day, children understood consequences. They understood that actions have results, that carelessness has costs." "In your day," Catherine repeated, the phrase hanging in the air between them like a challenge. Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, in my day. When children were taught proper respect for their elders and their position. When mothers understood that their primary responsibility was to their family, not to their projects." The word projects was delivered with such disdain that Catherine felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Her work wasn't a hobby or a distraction, it was a calling, a way to use her platform for genuine good. She had spent years building programs that made real differences in people's lives, and she did it while being a devoted mother and supportive wife. "My work helps thousands of families," Catherine said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "It provides support for children who don't have the advantages mine do. It creates awareness for issues that matter. And, while you're saving the world, who's watching your own children? Who's ensuring they understand their responsibilities?" The accusation was unfair and they both knew it. Catherine was present for her children's important moments, involved in their education, careful to balance her public duties with her private role as a mother. William supported her work completely, understanding that it was important not just to her but to the monarchy's future relevance. "I watch my children," Catherine said quietly. "I teach them every day. I teach them kindness, compassion, and service. I teach them that their privilege comes with responsibility to help others." "Pretty words," Camilla replied dismissively. "But, when Charlotte can't arrange flowers without destroying valuable property, when she cries at the first sign of correction, one has to wonder what exactly she's learning." The criticism of Charlotte was like a red flag to Catherine's protective instincts. Whatever issues she might have with Camilla's attitude toward her personally, involving her daughter crossed a line that Catherine would not tolerate. "Charlotte is 9 years old," she said, her voice now carrying a warning edge. "She's curious, intelligent, and eager to please. She deserves encouragement, not harsh judgment for minor accidents." "Minor accidents," Camilla repeated with a shake of her head. "That's exactly the attitude that leads to entitled, careless adults. Standards exist for a reason, Catherine. Expectations exist for a reason. And, what exactly are your expectations?" Catherine asked, crossing her arms. "That my children live in fear of disappointing you? That they approach every interaction walking on eggshells? I expect them to understand their position and behave accordingly. I expect them to show proper respect for tradition and protocol. I expect them to be prepared for the roles they will one day fill." The words were delivered with such authority, such certainty, that Catherine almost felt like a child herself being lectured. But she wasn't a child, and she wasn't going to stand by while her daughter was made to feel small and inadequate. "And I want them to be happy," Catherine said simply. "I want them to feel loved and supported, to know that making mistakes is part of learning, to understand that their worth isn't tied to their perfection. Camilla's expression suggested she found such ideas naive, even dangerous. Happiness is a luxury, Catherine. Duty is a necessity. The sooner Charlotte and her brothers understand that distinction, the better served they'll be. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. The idea of her children growing up believing that happiness was secondary to duty, that their feelings mattered less than appearances, was everything she had fought against since becoming a member of the royal family. They can have both, she said firmly. They can understand duty and still be happy. They can serve their country and still feel joy in their lives. Can they? Camilla asked, her tone suggesting deep skepticism. Look around you, Catherine. Look at this family's history. How many truly happy stories do you see? The question hung in the air, weighted with decades of royal marriages that had ended in scandal, of children who had struggled under the pressure of their positions, of lives lived in service to duty at the expense of personal fulfillment. Catherine thought of William, of the man she had fallen in love with partly because he had managed to maintain his humanity despite everything he had endured. She thought of how hard they both worked to create a different kind of royal family, one that could serve with dedication while still prioritizing love and emotional health. I see my husband, Catherine said quietly. I see a man who understands both duty and happiness, who serves his country without sacrificing his heart. That's what I want for my children. Camilla's smile was patronizing. How wonderfully optimistic. I hope for your sake that reality doesn't intrude too harshly on that fairy tale. The dismissive tone, the casual cruelty of the words, finally, pushed Catherine past the point of diplomatic politeness. She had endured the criticism of her parenting, the disparagement of her work, and the general air of superiority, but this mockery of her hopes for her children's future was unacceptable. It's not a fairy tale, she said, her voice growing cold. It's a choice. Every day, we choose whether to lead with fear or with love, whether to tear down or build up, whether to support each other or compete. How very modern of you, Camilla replied, the words dripping with disdain. Catherine felt her hands clench at her sides. The word modern was clearly meant as an insult, a dismissal of everything Catherine represented and valued. Yes, it is modern, she agreed, no longer trying to hide her anger. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of raising children who care about others, who aren't afraid to show emotion, who understand that strength comes from compassion, not cruelty. Cruelty? Camilla's voice rose slightly. I hardly think expecting proper behavior constitutes cruelty. Berating a 9-year-old girl for an accident is cruelty, Catherine shot back, her composure finally cracking. Making her feel ashamed of her natural enthusiasm is cruelty. Teaching her that love is conditional on perfection is cruelty. The words hung in the air between them, stark and unavoidable. For a moment, neither woman spoke, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Camilla was the first to break the silence, her voice now icy with royal authority. I think you forget yourself, Catherine. I think you forget exactly who you're speaking to. I know exactly who I'm speaking to, Catherine replied, her own voice steady despite her racing heart. I'm speaking to someone who just made my daughter cry because she dared to show interest in helping with something beautiful. The standoff stretched between them, years of carefully suppressed tensions finally, erupting into open conflict. Catherine could feel her heart pounding, could feel the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing down on her shoulders. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of palace life continuing, staff moving through corridors, the murmur of distant conversations, the tick of ancient clocks marking time. But, in this room, in this moment, there was only the electric tension between two very different women with two very different visions of what the royal family should be. Catherine knew that this conversation would change things. There would be no going back to polite pretense, no returning to the careful dance of diplomatic interactions they had maintained for years. The facade had cracked, revealing the fundamental disagreements that had always lurked beneath the surface. As she looked at Camilla's stern, unyielding expression, Catherine felt a familiar protective fire burning in her chest. This wasn't just about flowers or proper behavior or even about respect for tradition. This was about the kind of environment her children would grow up in, the kind of family they would become, the kind of legacy they would inherit. She thought of Charlotte's tear-filled eyes, of the way her bright, curious daughter had shrunk under Camilla's criticism. She thought of George and Louis, of all the small moments of joy and discovery that could be crushed under the weight of unrealistic expectations and harsh judgment. No. She would not allow it. She would not stand by while her children's spirits were dimmed in the name of tradition or protocol or any other excuse for emotional cruelty. The battle lines were drawn, and Catherine was prepared to fight. The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Catherine found herself going through the motions of royal routine while her mind churned with anger and protective instincts. She attended a brief meeting with her private secretary about upcoming engagements, smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals, but her thoughts kept returning to Charlotte's hurt expression and Camilla's cutting words. When lunchtime arrived, Catherine deliberately chose to eat with her children in their private dining room rather than join the formal family meal. She needed time to process what had happened, to decide how to handle the situation without escalating it further. More importantly, she needed to be with Charlotte, to gauge how deeply the morning's events had affected her daughter. Charlotte seemed quieter than usual as they sat around the intimate table overlooking the palace gardens. She picked at her sandwich, her usual animated chatter replaced by contemplative silence. George and Louis, her older and younger brothers respectively, sensed the subdued mood and moderated their own behavior accordingly. "The writing instructor said I'm ready to try jumping next week," George offered, attempting to fill the silence with normal childhood excitement. "That's wonderful, darling," Catherine replied, genuinely pleased but distracted. She watched Charlotte push lettuce around her plate without eating it. Louis, at 7 still young enough to wear his emotions openly, looked between his mother and sister with concern. "Is Charlotte sad?" he asked directly, as only a child would. Charlotte looked up quickly, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Louis. Just thinking." Catherine's heart clenched. Charlotte was already learning to hide her feelings, to present a composed facade even when hurting inside. It was exactly what Catherine had hoped to protect her children from, this premature burden of emotional performance. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Catherine asked gently, reaching across the table to touch Charlotte's hand. Charlotte glanced around at her brothers, then back at her mother. Catherine could see her weighing her words, deciding what was safe to say. "I was wondering if Grandmama Camilla is right," Charlotte said finally, her voice small. "About me being careless. About not knowing how to behave properly." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. In just one morning, Camilla had managed to plant seeds of self-doubt in a confident, spirited 9-year-old girl. The damage was already taking root, causing Charlotte to question herself rather than simply learning from a mistake. "Oh, my darling," Catherine said, moving her chair closer to Charlotte's. "You are absolutely not careless. You are curious and enthusiastic and kind. Those are wonderful qualities, not flaws." "But the flowers can be replaced," Catherine said firmly. "Your confidence and joy are far more precious than any arrangement." George, at 11 already showing signs of the future king he would become, spoke up with unexpected maturity. "Grandmama Camilla is sometimes very strict," he said carefully. "She has different ideas about things than Mummy and Papa do." Catherine felt a surge of pride at her eldest son's diplomatic wisdom, even as she worried that he was already learning to navigate family politics at such a young age. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid, her children having to choose sides or walk carefully around family members. "Different isn't necessarily wrong," Catherine said, trying to be fair while also protecting her daughter. "But there are many ways to teach and guide, and some are kinder than others." Charlotte looked up at her with those wide, intelligent eyes that reminded Catherine so much of William. "Will you teach me the proper way to arrange flowers, Mummy? So I don't make mistakes next time?" The question broke Catherine's heart even as it filled her with fierce love for her daughter's resilience. Rather than being crushed by criticism, Charlotte was seeking to learn and improve. But Catherine hated that her daughter felt the need to prove herself worthy of basic kindness. "Of course I will," Catherine said, pulling Charlotte into a hug. "But you weren't wrong this morning, darling. You were helping, which is always the right thing to do. Sometimes when we're learning, things don't go perfectly, and that's absolutely normal." After lunch, Catherine made arrangements for the children to spend the afternoon with their governess while she dealt with what she knew would be an uncomfortable but necessary conversation with William. He was scheduled to return from his morning engagements within the hour, and Catherine needed to prepare him for what had transpired. She found herself pacing in their private sitting room, rehearsing different ways to explain the situation without sounding petty or vindictive. William had always been protective of his children, but he also valued family harmony and would want to handle any conflicts diplomatically. Catherine understood this, but she also knew that some lines could not be uncrossed, some boundaries could not be ignored. When William finally arrived, he immediately sensed her agitation. After more than a decade together, he could read her moods as easily as she could read his. "What's wrong?" he asked without preamble, crossing the room to take her hands in his. Catherine looked into his familiar blue eyes, seeing concern and love there, and felt some of her tension ease. Whatever happened, they would face it together. "There was an incident this morning with Charlotte and your stepmother," she began, choosing her words carefully. William's expression immediately grew alert. "What kind of incident?" Catherine recounted the morning's events, watching William's face grow increasingly serious as she described Camilla's harsh treatment of Charlotte and the dismissive comments about Catherine's own work and parenting approach. When she finished, William was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "She made Charlotte cry?" he asked finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "More than that," Catherine replied. "She made Charlotte doubt herself. She made her feel ashamed for being enthusiastic and curious. She planted seeds of self-criticism that could take root and affect Charlotte's confidence for years." William stood abruptly, running his hands through his hair in a gesture Catherine recognized as barely controlled fury. "This is unacceptable," he said flatly. "Completely unacceptable." "I'm glad you agree," Catherine said, relief flooding through her. "But how do we handle it? This isn't just about one incident, William. It's about fundamental differences in how we want to raise our children." William sat back down, taking her hands again. "Tell me exactly what she said about your work." Catherine repeated Camilla's dismissive comments about her causes and projects, watching William's expression grow increasingly dark. "She questioned your priorities as a mother," he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She implied that my work takes away from my attention to the children, that I'm not teaching them proper behavior or respect for tradition." William's laugh was bitter. "That's rich, coming from someone who," he stopped himself, clearly deciding that whatever he had been about to say would be inappropriate. "Who what?" Catherine asked, sensing there were deeper issues at play. William shook his head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that she had no right to speak to you or Charlotte that way." "None whatsoever." Catherine studied her husband's face, seeing layers of old frustration and newer anger warring beneath his composed exterior. "This isn't the first time she's overstepped, is it?" William was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much to share. "She has very definite opinions about how things should be done," he said finally. "About what the royal family should look like, how children should behave, what constitutes appropriate priorities. And those opinions conflict with ours?" "Fundamentally," William admitted. "She comes from a different generation, a different approach to royal duty. She believes in rigid hierarchy, strict protocol, emotional restraint as a virtue. She sees your approach to parenting as too permissive, too emotional." Catherine felt a chill run through her. "And what does your father think?" William's expression grew pained. "He tends to defer to her judgment on family matters. He trusts her experience, values her opinion. He sees her as having successfully navigated royal life for decades." The implications were clear and troubling. If King Charles supported Camilla's approach to child rearing and family dynamics, then this conflict was about more than just one unpleasant morning. It was about the fundamental direction of the royal family's future. "So where does that leave us?" Catherine asked quietly. "It leaves us protecting our children and standing by our principles," William said firmly. "I don't care what anyone thinks about our parenting approach. Our children are happy, well-adjusted, and kind. That's what matters." Catherine felt a surge of love and gratitude for her husband's unwavering support. "But the politics of it, William. The family dynamics. How do we navigate that without creating a permanent rift?" William's expression was grim. "Some rifts are necessary, Catherine. Some principles are non-negotiable. I will not allow anyone, family or not, to make my children feel ashamed of who they are or to criticize my wife for being an extraordinary mother and an incredible advocate for others." The strength in his voice, the absolute certainty of his support, made Catherine's eyes fill with tears of relief and love. She had known William would support her, but hearing him state it so unequivocally, knowing he was prepared to take a stand even against his own family if necessary, meant everything. "What do we do next?" she asked. First, I'm going to have a conversation with Camilla, William said, his tone leaving no doubt about how that conversation would go. She needs to understand that how she spoke to Charlotte and about you is completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated. And if she doesn't agree to change her approach? William's jaw tightened. Then, she'll find her access to our children significantly limited. I won't have them walking on eggshells around their own family members. Catherine nodded, feeling both relief and apprehension. Taking such a stand would likely create significant family tension, possibly affecting their relationships with King Charles as well. But, the alternative, allowing Camilla to continue undermining their children's confidence and criticizing their parenting choices, was unacceptable. There's something else, Catherine said hesitantly. Something she said about happiness being a luxury and duty being a necessity. About how few happy stories there are in this family's history. William's expression grew pained. She's not entirely wrong about the history, he admitted. But that doesn't mean we have to repeat it. That doesn't mean our children have to grow up believing that service requires sacrificing joy. She seemed to think our approach was naive. That reality would eventually intrude on our fairy tale, as she put it. William took Catherine's face in his hands, looking directly into her eyes. Our love isn't a fairy tale, Catherine. Our family isn't naive idealism. We've worked hard to create something real and strong and healthy. We've learned from past mistakes, from previous generations' failures. We're not going to let anyone undermine that. Catherine leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his conviction. I just worry about Charlotte. About how this morning affected her. Then, we make sure she knows she's loved and valued exactly as she is, William said firmly. We continue to encourage her curiosity and enthusiasm. We show her through our actions that her feelings matter, that making mistakes is human, that she doesn't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. And, we teach her that sometimes adults are wrong, Catherine added, thinking of Charlotte's polite apology to Camilla despite having done nothing that truly warranted criticism. Especially that, William agreed. She needs to understand that respect doesn't require accepting mistreatment, even from family members. As they sat together, planning their response to the morning's events, Catherine felt a mixture of determination and sadness. Determination to protect her children and stand by her principles, sadness that family relationships had to become battlegrounds for fundamental values. She thought about the royal family's long history, about the price so many had paid for duty over happiness, protocol over authentic emotion. She thought about Diana, William's mother, who had struggled so publicly with the constraints and expectations of royal life. She thought about the lessons learned and the promises she and William had made to do better for their own children. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower through the windows when William stood, his decision made. I'm going to speak with Camilla now, he said, straightening his shoulders in preparation for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. Catherine stood as well, catching his hand. Be diplomatic but firm, she advised. We don't want to burn bridges unnecessarily, but we can't allow this to continue. William nodded, then pulled her into his arms. Whatever happens, we face it together, he said quietly. Our family, our children, our principles, they come first. As Catherine watched him leave for what she knew would be a conversation that could reshape family relationships for years to come, she felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. They were taking a stand for their children's emotional well-being, for their right to grow up feeling loved and accepted even when they made mistakes. The easy days of diplomatic pretense were over. The real fight for their family's future was just beginning. William found Camilla in her private study, seated behind an ornate mahogany desk that had once belonged to Queen Mary. She was reviewing correspondence with her private secretary, but looked up as he entered, dismissing her staff with a subtle nod. William, how lovely, she said, her tone pleasant but cautious. Something in his expression must have warned her that this wasn't a social visit. We need to talk, William said without preamble, taking a seat across from her desk without being invited. Camilla set down her fountain pen with deliberate precision, her movements careful and controlled. About this morning's incident with Charlotte. Camilla's expression didn't change, but William caught a slight stiffening of her posture. Ah. I suppose Catherine was upset about my correcting Charlotte's behavior? Upset doesn't begin to cover it, William replied, his voice carrying a warning edge. And, frankly, neither does correcting behavior. What you did was berate a 9-year-old child for an accident. I hardly think. No, William interrupted, his royal authority making itself known for the first time in their relationship. You don't get to minimize this. Charlotte came home in tears, doubting herself, questioning whether she's capable of behaving properly. That's not education, Camilla. That's emotional harm. Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly at his tone, but she maintained her composure. William, I understand you're protective of your children, but sometimes difficult lessons are necessary. Charlotte needs to understand that she's loved and valued, that making mistakes is part of learning, and that her enthusiasm and curiosity are gifts, not flaws. William cut her off again. What she doesn't need is to be made to feel ashamed for being a normal, spirited child. Spirited, Camilla repeated, the word clearly distasteful to her. Is that what we're calling lack of discipline now? William felt his jaw clench. Charlotte is one of the most well-behaved children you could hope to meet. She's kind, thoughtful, intelligent, and, yes, enthusiastic about life. If you see those qualities as problems to be corrected rather than strengths to be nurtured, then the problem isn't with Charlotte. The implication hung in the air between them, clear and challenging. Camilla's expression hardened slightly. I see, she said coolly. And, I suppose Catherine has filled your head with all sorts of dramatic interpretations of a simple correction? The dismissive reference to Catherine sparked something dangerous in William's chest. Catherine didn't need to interpret anything. I know my daughter, and I know when she's been hurt. More than that, I trust my wife's judgment completely when it comes to our children's welfare. Your wife, Camilla said, the phrase carrying subtle emphasis, has very modern ideas about child-rearing. Not all of them are compatible with the realities of royal life. Meaning what, exactly? Camilla leaned back in her chair, studying William with calculating eyes. Meaning that royal children need to understand discipline, protocol, and self-control from an early age. They need to learn that their actions have consequences, that carelessness can be costly, that emotion must be properly managed. Catherine's approach of coddling and constant reassurance may feel kinder, but it doesn't prepare them for the realities they'll face. William felt his anger building, but forced himself to remain controlled. And what realities are those? A life where they're never allowed to make mistakes? Where showing emotion is seen as weakness? Where they have to earn love through perfect behavior? A life where they understand their responsibilities, Camilla replied firmly. Where they comprehend the weight of their positions, the importance of maintaining standards, the necessity of putting duty before personal comfort. At 9 years old? William's voice rose slightly. She's 9, Camilla. She should be worried about her writing lessons and her art projects, not whether she's worthy of basic kindness from her family. Camilla's expression suggested she found his perspective naive. The earlier they learn these lessons, the better prepared they'll be. Look at your own upbringing, William. Would you say you were harmed by high expectations and firm discipline? The question hit closer to home than William cared to admit. His own childhood had been marked by rigid protocol, emotional restraint, and the constant awareness that his personal happiness was secondary to his role. It had taken years of therapy and Catherine's patient love to help him understand that he could be both a dedicated future king and an emotionally healthy human being. I would say, William replied carefully, that I spent too many years believing that duty and happiness were mutually exclusive. I spent too long thinking that showing emotion was weakness, that asking for help was failure, that my worth was tied to my performance rather than my humanity. I don't want that for my children. And yet you turned out admirably, Camilla observed. You're a dedicated son, a committed husband, a capable father, and a future king who inspires confidence. Surely that suggests the approach had merit. William studied her face, seeing genuine conviction there alongside the subtle manipulation. She truly believed that her methods were not only appropriate but necessary. That made the conversation more difficult, because he couldn't simply dismiss her as deliberately cruel. I turned out well because of Catherine, he said quietly. Because she taught me that I could be all those things you mentioned while still being human. Because she showed me that strength comes from acknowledging weakness, that real leadership requires empathy, that love doesn't make you vulnerable, it makes you powerful. Camilla's expression softened slightly, perhaps hearing the genuine emotion in his voice. I don't doubt Catherine's positive influence on you, William. But that doesn't mean her approach is universally applicable. Royal children face unique pressures, unique scrutiny. They need different preparation than ordinary children. They need more support, not less, William countered. They need to know that their family is their safe haven, not another source of judgment and criticism. They need to understand that they're loved unconditionally, not just when they perform perfectly. Love and discipline aren't mutually exclusive, Camilla said, her tone becoming more conciliatory. But discipline must be consistent and clear. Children need boundaries, William. They need to understand consequences. I agree completely, William said, surprising her. But there's a difference between teaching consequences and humiliating a child. There's a difference between setting boundaries and crushing spirit. Charlotte understood that she had made a mistake. She apologized. She offered to help fix it. She was genuinely sorry. What more did you want from her? Camilla was quiet for a moment, perhaps recognizing that her response had been disproportionate to Charlotte's actions. Perhaps I was firmer than necessary, she admitted reluctantly. It was the closest thing to an apology William was likely to get, and he recognized it as such. But acknowledgement of the problem wasn't enough. He needed assurance that it wouldn't happen again. Charlotte idolizes you, he said quietly. All my children do. You have enormous influence over how they see themselves and their place in this family. When you criticize them harshly, when you dismiss their enthusiasm as carelessness, when you make them feel that they have to be perfect to be worthy of love, you're shaping their fundamental beliefs about themselves. Camilla's expression grew thoughtful, perhaps beginning to understand the deeper implications of her approach. I want them to respect tradition, she said finally. I want them to understand the importance of their roles, the weight of their inheritance. I worry that too much kindness, too much accommodation of childhood whims, will leave them unprepared for the harsh realities of public life. William leaned forward, his expression earnest. I understand that worry. I share it, actually. But I believe that children who feel secure in their family's love are stronger, not weaker, when facing external challenges. Children who know their worth isn't conditional on perfection are more resilient when dealing with criticism and pressure. And children who are never corrected, never held to high standards? Are not what I'm describing, William said firmly. Catherine and I have high expectations for our children. We expect kindness, honesty, effort, consideration for others. We just don't expect perfection, and we don't withdraw our love when they make mistakes. Camilla studied him for a long moment, perhaps weighing his words against her own experiences and beliefs. Your mother, she said carefully, struggled with the balance between royal duty and personal happiness. I wouldn't want to see history repeat itself. The mention of Diana was both surprising and revealing. William felt a familiar pang of loss and protectiveness when his mother was referenced, but he also heard genuine concern in Camilla's voice. My mother's struggles weren't caused by too much love or support, William said quietly. They were caused by isolation, by feeling that she had to be perfect, by believing that showing vulnerability was failure. The royal family's response to her difficulties was to demand more control, more conformity, more emotional restraint. That approach failed spectacularly. Camilla nodded slowly, perhaps acknowledging the truth in his words. I want to learn from those mistakes, William continued. I want my children to know that they can come to us with problems, that they don't have to pretend to be perfect, that their humanity is an asset, not a liability. And if that makes them less regal? Less suited to their roles? William smiled, the first genuine warmth he'd shown since entering the room. Have you met my wife? She's kind, empathetic, emotional, and real. She connects with people precisely because she doesn't pretend to be perfect. She's also one of the most regal, dignified, and effective members of this family. Humanity and royalty aren't opposites, Camilla. The best royals are the most human. Camilla was quiet for a long time, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been throughout their conversation. I suppose I worry that I failed with my own children in some ways, she admitted. That I was too permissive, too indulgent. I see Charlotte's spirited nature and I worry about the challenges she'll face, the criticism she'll endure. I thought perhaps if I could teach her early to be more controlled, it would serve her better in the long run. The admission revealed depths of insecurity and regret that William hadn't expected. He felt his anger cooling slightly, replaced by something approaching understanding. Charlotte will face challenges, he agreed. But she'll face them better if she's confident in who she is, if she knows her family supports her, if she's learned to view mistakes as learning opportunities rather than moral failures. And, you truly believe Catherine's approach will prepare her for royal life? William thought of his wife's grace under pressure, her ability to connect authentically with people from all walks of life, her strength in facing criticism and maintaining her principles. I think Catherine's approach created Catherine, he said simply. And Catherine is everything a modern royal should be. Camilla's smile was rueful. You're quite convinced of your wife's perfection, aren't you? I'm convinced of her goodness, William corrected. And her wisdom when it comes to our children. Which brings me to the other issue we need to discuss. Camilla's expression grew wary again. Which is? Your comments about Catherine's work, about her priorities as a mother. That was completely inappropriate and I won't tolerate it happening again. The warmth that had crept into their conversation disappeared instantly. I simply expressed concern about balance. You dismissed years of meaningful work as projects and causes, William interrupted. You implied that her dedication to helping others somehow detracts from her abilities as a mother. That was not only wrong, it was insulting. Camilla's jaw tightened. I merely suggested that charity work, however worthy, shouldn't take precedence over family responsibilities. Catherine's work doesn't take precedence over family, William said firmly. It's part of how she teaches our children about service, about using privilege responsibly, about caring for others. Her example shows them what modern royalty can be. Modern royalty, Camilla repeated, and William could hear skepticism in her tone. Yes, modern royalty. Relevant, connected, genuinely helpful to people's lives. The kind of royalty that earns respect rather than simply demanding it. The philosophical divide between them was becoming clearer with each exchange. Camilla represented traditional royal values, duty, hierarchy, emotional restraint, respect for protocol above all else. William and Catherine represented a newer approach, service, connection, emotional intelligence, adaptation to contemporary needs. I suppose we have fundamentally different views of what the monarchy should be, Camilla said finally. We do, William agreed. But, regardless of our philosophical differences, there are practical boundaries that need to be respected. My children's emotional well-being is non-negotiable. My wife's dignity and contributions to this family are non-negotiable. Clear? Camilla studied him for a long moment, perhaps recognizing that he had inherited more than just his mother's compassion, he had also inherited her fierce protectiveness when it came to family. Clear, she said finally, though her tone suggested the concession came reluctantly. William stood, the formal conclusion to their conversation evident in his posture. I hope we can move forward in a way that respects everyone's contributions and protects everyone's well-being. I hope so too, Camilla replied, though they both knew that fundamental differences couldn't be resolved in a single conversation. As William left her study, he felt both relief and apprehension. The immediate crisis had been addressed, boundaries had been established, and Charlotte would be protected from future harsh criticism. But the underlying tensions remained, the philosophical divide was still there, and the delicate balance of family dynamics had been permanently altered. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as they all learned to navigate these new boundaries while maintaining the appearance of family unity that their roles required. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation over Charlotte's flower arranging incident, and the palace had settled into a new, carefully calibrated routine. The change was subtle but noticeable to anyone who understood the intricate dynamics of royal family life. Interactions remained polite, even warm on the surface, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't existed before. Catherine found herself hyper-aware of every interaction between Camilla and her children. Not in a paranoid way, but with the protective vigilance of a mother who had seen her child hurt and was determined not to let it happen again. She noticed how Charlotte's natural exuberance was slightly more contained around her step-grandmother, how her daughter had learned to gauge Camilla's mood before speaking freely. The observation broke Catherine's heart even as it made her proud. Charlotte was learning to read social situations with increasing sophistication, but she shouldn't have to navigate emotional landmines within her own family. The fact that her bright, spirited daughter was developing such careful social awareness at 9 years old was both impressive and tragic. William had kept his word about establishing boundaries. His conversation with Camilla had resulted in noticeably different behavior toward the children. She was still formal, still focused on proper protocol, but the harsh edge had been replaced by measured correctness. It was an improvement, but Catherine wondered if the careful politeness was actually worse than honest emotion, even negative emotion. The children seemed to sense the change without understanding it. George, with his natural diplomatic instincts, had adapted quickly to the new dynamic, maintaining respectful distance while still being genuinely affectionate with his step-grandmother. Louis, still young enough to be largely unaware of adult tensions, continued his cheerful interactions with minimal change. But Charlotte, sensitive and perceptive like her mother, struggled more with the altered atmosphere. She had always been Camilla's favorite among the children, drawn to her step-grandmother's stories of royal history and protocol. The cooling of that relationship, even if it was ultimately healthier, left Charlotte confused and somewhat bereft. Catherine watched her daughter navigate these complex emotions with a mixture of pride and sadness. Charlotte was learning important lessons about relationships, boundaries, and self-worth, but at a cost that no child should have to pay. The broader family dynamics were also shifting in subtle ways. King Charles, while never directly addressing the incident, seemed to have received some version of events from Camilla. His interactions with Catherine remained warm but carried a slight formality that hadn't been there before. She could sense his divided loyalties, love for his granddaughter and respect for his daughter-in-law warring with support for his wife and concern about family unity. It was during a family dinner 3 weeks after the flower incident that the simmering tensions finally came to a head in an unexpected way. The occasion was Charlotte's performance in her school's autumn recital. She had been selected to recite a poem about courage, a piece she had chosen herself and practiced diligently for weeks. Catherine and William were immensely proud of their daughter's preparation and poise, and the extended family had been invited to attend the performance and join them for dinner afterward. Charlotte had been radiant during her recital, delivering her poem about facing fears and standing up for what's right with confidence and genuine feeling. Her clear voice and natural stage presence had drawn appreciative murmurs from the audience, and Catherine had felt tears of pride watching her daughter command the stage with such grace. The dinner at Kensington Palace afterward had begun pleasantly enough. Charlotte was glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done, happily recounting details of the performance for those who had asked. The conversation flowed easily around topics of school, upcoming royal engagements, and general family news. It was when Charlotte mentioned her upcoming school project that the evening took an unexpected turn. "Miss Henderson says we can choose anyone we admire to write about," Charlotte explained excitedly. "Someone who shows courage and helps other people. I want to write about Mummy." The declaration was so innocent, so naturally loving, that Catherine felt her heart swell with emotion. Around the table, there were warm smiles and murmurs of approval from most family members. "What an excellent choice," King Charles said warmly. "Your mother has certainly shown remarkable courage and dedication in her work." Charlotte beamed at her grandfather's approval, then turned to Camilla with the eager expectation of a child seeking validation from all the adults she loves. "Don't you think Mummy would be a good subject for my courage project, Grandmama Camilla?" The question hung in the air, innocent and trusting, while the adults around the table held their breath. Camilla found herself in an impossible position, unable to criticize Catherine's worthiness as a subject for a courage project without appearing petty, but clearly uncomfortable with the direct request for praise. "I'm sure you'll write a lovely report, Charlotte," Camilla replied carefully, her tone neutral enough to avoid commitment while not crushing Charlotte's enthusiasm. But Charlotte, with a child's persistence, pressed on. "Miss Henderson says we should write about people who make a difference in the world. Mummy helps lots of families with her work, doesn't she?" Catherine felt her chest tighten, recognizing that her daughter was inadvertently walking into a minefield. She tried to catch Charlotte's eye, to gently redirect the conversation, but Charlotte was focused entirely on Camilla, genuinely seeking her step-grandmother's opinion about something important to her. Camilla glanced around the table, clearly aware that her response was being carefully observed by everyone present. King Charles was watching with particular attention, perhaps recognizing the delicate nature of the moment. "Your mother certainly keeps very busy," Camilla said finally, the words technically positive but carrying an undertone that made Catherine's jaw clench. William's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his expression growing alert. George and Louis continued eating, not yet old enough to fully understand the subtext of adult conversation, but Charlotte's bright expression faltered slightly. "Busy helping people," Charlotte clarified, as if Camilla might have misunderstood. "She visits schools and talks to families about children's feelings. She helps make programs that teach parents how to help their children when they're sad or scared." The description was so earnest, so full of genuine pride and understanding of Catherine's work, that Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Her 9-year-old daughter had a clearer grasp of the importance and impact of her charitable work than some adults in her own family. Indeed, Camilla replied, her tone growing cooler despite obvious efforts to remain pleasant. Very busy with all sorts of activities. The word activities was delivered with just enough emphasis to make its dismissive nature clear to every adult at the table. Catherine felt her protective instincts flare as she saw Charlotte's confusion deepen. "They're not activities, Grandmama Camilla," Charlotte said, her voice smaller now but still trying to explain. "They're important work. Mummy helps people understand how to make children feel better when they're hurt inside." The innocence of the correction, the child's attempt to educate her elder about something she clearly cared about deeply, created a moment of crystalline tension around the dining table. Camilla's smile became strained. "Of course, darling. I'm sure your mother's work is very meaningful to her." The pause before work was so deliberate, so pointed, that it might as well have been air quotes. Catherine felt something snap inside her chest. "It's meaningful to the thousands of families we've helped," Catherine said quietly, her voice steady but carrying steel underneath. "It's meaningful to the children who now have access to mental health resources because of our advocacy. It's meaningful to the parents who finally have tools to support their children's emotional development." The shift from polite dinner conversation to direct confrontation was immediate and electric. Charlotte looked between her mother and step-grandmother with growing confusion and concern. Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sure it feels very important to those involved." "Feels important?" Catherine repeated, her composure beginning to crack. "Mental health awareness doesn't just feel important, it is important. Early childhood development isn't a hobby or a feeling, it's a critical foundation for healthy societies." "Catherine," William said quietly, recognizing the warning signs of his wife's protective anger but uncertain whether to encourage or restrain her. But Catherine was beyond diplomatic restraint. 3 weeks of watching her daughter tiptoe around family dynamics, 3 weeks of seeing Charlotte's natural joy slightly dimmed by fear of criticism, 3 weeks of having her life's work dismissed as self-indulgent hobbies had reached a breaking point. "You know what I find interesting, Camilla?" Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger. "This morning Charlotte delivered a beautiful poem about courage, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. She chose that poem herself, practiced it for weeks, and performed it with confidence and grace. A normal grandmother would be bursting with pride, would be telling her how brave and talented she is." Catherine, King Charles started, clearly recognizing that the conversation was spiraling beyond diplomatic territory. "But, instead," Catherine continued, ignoring the warning, "we're sitting here listening to my daughter beg for recognition of work that has measurably improved thousands of lives, work that represents everything this family should stand for: service, compassion, making a real difference in people's daily existence. And the response is dismissive comments about activities and keeping busy." Charlotte's eyes were wide with confusion and dawning distress as she realized that her innocent questions had somehow caused conflict between adults she loved. Camilla's mask of polite restraint finally slipped. "I hardly think a child's school project requires such dramatics, Catherine." "This isn't about a school project," Catherine shot back. "This is about a little girl who loves her family and wants to feel proud of them, who wants them to be proud of each other. This is about a child who shouldn't have to navigate adult politics and petty resentments when she's talking about her mother's work helping other children." "That's quite enough," Camilla said sharply, her own composure cracking under the pressure of public criticism. "No, it's not nearly enough," Catherine replied, standing up from her chair, her protective instincts in full force. Charlotte asked a simple question born out of love and pride. She deserves a simple, loving answer. She deserves to know that her family supports each other, that her mother's work to help vulnerable children is valued and respected. The dining room fell into stunned silence. George and Louis had stopped eating entirely, sensing the gravity of the adult conflict even if they didn't understand its roots. Charlotte's face was flushed with embarrassment and confusion, tears threatening to spill over. King Charles cleared his throat carefully. "Perhaps we should." "No," Catherine said firmly, her gaze fixed on Camilla. "Charlotte needs to hear this. She needs to understand that standing up for what's right, protecting people you love, and refusing to accept dismissive treatment aren't character flaws to be corrected. They're strengths to be celebrated." Charlotte looked up at her mother with a mixture of awe and concern, perhaps beginning to understand that this moment was about much more than her school project. Camilla's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment at being confronted so directly in front of the family. "I will not sit here and be lectured about family values by someone who what?" Catherine interrupted, her voice dangerous now. By someone who puts her children's emotional health above royal protocol? By someone who believes that love and support are more important than rigid hierarchy? By someone who thinks that helping vulnerable families is more valuable than preserving outdated ideas about royal dignity? The words hung in the air like thrown gauntlets, each one a direct challenge to everything Camilla represented and believed in. William reached for Catherine's hand, not to restrain her but to show his support, his solidarity in this moment of open confrontation. "That's exactly what I mean," Camilla said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "This family has survived for centuries because we understand duty, protocol, the proper order of things. We don't indulge emotional outbursts, we don't air our disagreements publicly, and we certainly don't allow personal feelings to override institutional stability." Catherine felt a moment of crystal-clear understanding. This was the fundamental divide, the unbridgeable gap between two completely different visions of what the royal family should be and become. "And look how well that's worked," Catherine said quietly, her anger transforming into something more powerful, absolute conviction. "Look at the marriages that failed, the children who struggled, the family members who felt isolated and unsupported. Look at the price that approach has demanded from the people who lived it." She turned to Charlotte, who was watching with wide, uncertain eyes. "Your poem tonight was about courage, sweetheart. Real courage isn't about being perfect or following every rule without question. Real courage is about standing up for people you love, protecting what matters most, and refusing to let anyone make you feel ashamed of caring deeply about others." Charlotte nodded slowly, her confusion beginning to clear as she recognized the strength and love in her mother's voice. Catherine looked around the table, meeting each family member's eyes in turn. "I won't apologize for believing that kindness matters more than protocol, that love matters more than hierarchy, that helping others matters more than maintaining appearances. And I certainly won't apologize for raising children who understand those same values." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, filled with years of unspoken tensions finally brought into the open. Everyone present understood that relationships had been fundamentally altered, that the careful diplomatic balance they had maintained was permanently disrupted. But Catherine felt lighter than she had in months, cleaner somehow, as if finally, speaking her truth had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She looked at her children, George serious and thoughtful, Louis wide-eyed but trusting, Charlotte gradually straightening with new understanding of her mother's strength. "Come on," Catherine said to her family, her voice gentle now but still firm. "Let's go home." As they prepared to leave, Charlotte slipped her hand into Catherine's, looking up with an expression of pure love and admiration. "I'm definitely writing my courage project about you, Mummy," she said quietly. Catherine squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling tears of pride and love fill her eyes. "And I'll be honored to be your subject, darling." The drive home was quiet, each family member processing the evening's events in their own way. But Catherine felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that she had protected her children's understanding of love, support, and family loyalty. The diplomatic consequences could be dealt with later. Tonight, her children had seen their mother stand up for what mattered most, and that lesson was worth any amount of royal displeasure. Some battles were worth fighting, some principles worth defending, some love worth protecting at any cost. As Catherine tucked Charlotte into bed that night, listening to her daughter excitedly plan her courage project, she knew she had fought the right battle for the right reasons. The palace politics would continue, the family dynamics would need time to heal, but her children would grow up knowing that they were loved unconditionally and that standing up for that love was not only acceptable, it was courageous.